Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, I consider myself an economic Thatcherite, and yet when I come to choose between money and lives, I always choose lives. So this House should remember that what should be at the forefront of every member's mind today is this is a vote where we are choosing whether or not to intervene to save lives. That's the key issue, not the monetary issue, which I'll come back to in a second. The government argues that this is a policy the United Kingdom can't afford. But we should remember, I mean, we've heard about this being a small fraction of borrowing. There's even an even smaller fraction of our spending. We spend in a non-COVID year at least £800 billion. So the £3.5 billion of saving we're talking about is less than 0.5% of that. That is what the Treasury tells us is the critical, overwhelming measure that forces us to do something which has such dramatic consequences as we are talking of today. And if the Chancellor says, as his press spokesman did in the course of last week, well, you find the money from somewhere else, asking that question of a past Public Accounts Committee chairman is very dangerous for a Chancellor, out of 800 million. But as my honourable friend said, we were in Cheshire and Amersham a week or two ago, and Cheryl Gillen would have said to the Chancellor, well, why don't you just cancel HS2? That's between 100 and 200 billion pounds. It would pay for 25 to 50 years of this shortfall. It's really that simple. So I don't really accept that what the Chancellor is saying, that this is the only place, indeed the best place, for savings to be found, is cutting aid, which will cost lives. Such a choice is morally reprehensible. Let's be clear about it. Morally reprehensible. I'll give way to my friend.
My right honourable friend is making an incredibly good point, but has he also noticed that in the Chancellor's outstanding policy on spending announced last November, the cut he's referring to, this cut of 1% of the borrowing on COVID last year, is the only cut that has been announced, the only one?
Yeah, well, my right honourable friend is right. I mean, that makes the priority of this cut even more morally representative. But indeed, as I think the spokesman of the SNP said, at the same time, we're actually increasing spending on defence. Now, I happen to agree with increasing spending on defence, but I don't agree with cutting spending on things that will lead to the need for more defence, namely migration, civil wars, and the rest of it. Now, as has been pointed out by my right honourable friend, by the honourable lady who's just spoke from Rotherham, by the Leader of the Opposition, the government's proposed double lock on return to 0.7% is deceptive. It's designed to look reasonable. But in fact, none of the people who have spoken so far actually stated the full case. Because although it's only been met once since 1990 under a Conservative government, and never been met really once just about under the government since the policy 0.7% policy was put in place, in fact it's never been met. It's actually never been met since 1970, because what the wording says is not a current budget surplus, but a sustainable current budget surplus. And all the current budget surplus we've been talking about so far have been 1 year. And frankly, the one under us in 2018 was 1 year for about 10 nanoseconds. It was a very, very tiny surplus. In practice, since the 1970s, we've not had a sustainable current surplus. So I'm afraid, under the actual wording in the statement, we're not looking at this for a very long time indeed. We've heard the Leader of the Opposition said years, possibly decades, possibly never, and I think he's right about that. Now, the proposal won't do anything, even if it were to be met, even if the conditions were met, to deal with the crises that are caused by the policy already, right now. The government argues the cuts are temporary, but death is never temporary. It causes deaths.
Hillary then.
Yeah.